So next question, we're moving to the decision phase of a pitch process. And I often find myself in the middle of this, and it's often much more complicated than it seems from the outside. So a big international pitch we did a couple of years ago took 6 months to get to a decision. The reason was a very lethargic, old school procurement team got involved and really dragged the whole heels of it. However, more commonly on an international pitch where you've got a group of clients, there's Martha from Spain, there's Pedro from Italy, there's someone from Eastern European, they've all got slightly different agendas, slightly different needs and requirements, and getting them to take a decision is often quite difficult. On the other hand, there are when you've got a tight team, then you can make that work. So it's, and I don't think agencies quite realise sometimes about how when you make a decision internally as a client, all the stakeholders you have. So that's the subject I want to sort of get to. So we've got Rebecca White from Heathrow, we've got Andrew Cocker from Expedia, we've got Helen McRae from Mindshare, and Scott Wilson from Conan Wolf. Please stand up. We're going to kick off with Rebecca.
Can you repeat the question again?
So the question is actually, what's the perfect way to make a decision? But I'm looking for you from a story about, on your recent pitching, what's it like as on a client team, and anything you can share with us?
I think, firstly, it's a small, perfectly formed client team. It's 8 to 12. That's the number.
That's
Anything
a lot.
More than that is absolute. No, it's unwieldy. It's unwieldy any more than that.
Just keep the microphone really close.
But by the same token, I think one
lot.
of the earlier points you made was, should the CEO be there? Or
Yeah.
it should be the key. I honestly think it should be the key decision maker for commercial should be there. And there was a process that we had recently, and when we went to the final pitch, when he said, they get us, we knew that these guys had won it. And there was a moment of change because it was not just the presentation, it was also the way they described the business, the challenges ahead, what would be planned, how the relationship would work, etc., that we understood, but we also knew would be able to be translated in a huge business.
If you, as CMO, had a different opinion?
Well, I did have a different opinion.
Okay, so how did you
we had a
that? You just went, all right.
We had a 4-stage process, and we had a very, very vigorous debate.
Okay.
And actually, Daryl made the point before. It was the combination between the people and the work.
Yes.
And for me, it was the work, and I went with the people, and I haven't regretted it since.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Helen.
Me?
Yes.
First, a decision is actually good. I am still waiting on a decision from a pitch, which is about 2 years old. I'm assuming the answer is no. But who knows?
Yeah.
So I think we as agencies, literally, the day after are like, and? So what's the answer? And obviously that's not going to be the case. But I think the decision making is for me is part of this, everything that we've discussed, right? It is about having a clear brief. It's about understanding what you want. It's about having a tight team. It's about having the people in the room who are going to make that decision throughout all the steps. And if they're not going to be there, I think Daryl said, then they're not going to be part of the decision-making process. And that means that you are actually going to have a faster and more expedient decision. Because, Scott, you made the point, there's nothing more disheartening than waiting and hearing nothing and then waiting and waiting. And you lose all of that momentum and that excitement, and that's a loss. It's a loss for both sides.
Andrew, you had a situation recently where your number two felt completely the opposite to you at one stage of the pitch in terms of making a choice. How did you handle that?
So I'll back up a little bit before I answer that question. But I think the reality is every client and every company is vastly different in terms of the decision-making process. And I guess the reality is in any international business, there are multiple stakeholders, and especially if that business is structured in a matrix way, it makes it very difficult. So you can be the lead marketer in the company, but you know it's not just your decision, because that's not how the culture of the business works. And so as long as you're upfront about that at the start, and everybody knows that there is a way that this will be decided, and it will be decided with some very clear rationale, that the members, the ideal world is that everybody that is involved in the pitch all the way through gets to be on the decision making. But again, the reality is, if the managing director or the CEO wants to be involved but can't make it to all the pitches, what are you going to do? You're certainly not going to say no. So I think the point is, every client and every situation is actually quite unique, and we all go into this with a very clear, clear set of parameters and goals. But it does change, and it changes for those business dynamic reasons. On the, how do you actually make the decision at the end of it when you have a difference of opinion? For me, this isn't, as a lead marketer in an organisation, it's not just your decision. Ultimately, you are the decision maker. But if it's the easiest way to have a team that is not going to follow you and is not going to work with you if you just overrule them straight from the offset. So I think you have to have time enough to have the debate. Ultimately, there's a decision maker, but you have to give that time.
Very good, thank you. Scott?
Okay, slightly different perspective on the decision-making process, and this harks back to the votes that about the live and the theoretical brief, and I think actually in my heart I would have voted entirely like the majority of this audience. But my story actually relates back to a pitch that I'm pleased to say we prevailed in earlier this year, which was actually a fictional brief with a fictional launch market. And normally I think good sense would have said we should have turned this one down, but having effectively challenged the clients, and it was either through confidentiality or lack of clarity, we actually decided to go for it. The team was incredibly excited about the brand and wouldn't let us walk away. But I think what was interesting for us in terms of the process is a lot of the theatre that goes into those genuinely live briefs, whether they are live or not, which is all about the razzle-dazzle and less about the chemistry. It actually forced us to try and get into the minds of the client and to confront what was the basis of that decision-making. And I think in our particular case, it was about demonstrating that, A, we actually had a network that actually we weren't strangers. It was about showing that we could enlist a network in a wave which would be 14 markets in a year and a half. And I think ultimately it was about confidence from the client who was under massive commercial pressure that they could actually do business with the agency. So I think we all have a theoretical best utopian approach, but in this particular case, it was an effective one because we had to go in a slightly different way than the norm.
Actually, we're running out. We've talked ourselves hard like a donkey, and so we're going to miss the next section. But just a quick question is, how many of you, client team, have made a decision on the day? Okay. Yes, you have. There was a story when I was working with Save the Children. Adam and Eve were really new. They were still in their startup mode. And they were the last one on the day. And I could just feel it. My antenna were going, they've got it. So I just went, okay. Team, would you mind leaving the room? And they were out and said, we're on, aren't we? Yeah, okay. Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring them down, and I'm going to say we've got a few issues we need to discuss. But when I bring them back into the room, I want you to think of your grandmother's underpants. Straight poker face. So I go up and say, all went quite well, but we've got a couple of issues we need to talk about. They came into the room thinking, oh, fuck, this hasn't gone well, has it? Sat down and said, there's one thing we want to ask you first. Will you work with us? And they went, yay! Brilliant. We had champagne. It was just the most amazing time, and the relationship has flown from then. It was absolutely fantastic.